Hey, this is Joe from Presonus. Today we're going to dive into the awesome but scandalous red light distortion. As long as I've used Studio One, I've used red light distortion as my dirt pedal in my session. So if you're a guitar player, you know guitarists have lots of pedals, but usually there's at least one that just makes things gross. Distorted, overdriven, nasty, and that can be really cool in certain situations. And when it comes to mixing, if you're new to mixing, you may not realize, but a lot of top mix engineers incorporate some form of saturation, overdrive, or straight up distortion, all of which the red light distortion can do, into their mixes. The first place I learned this was when I was learning from Nashville area producers. We're talking country music, and they would almost always put a SansAmp pedal or a SansAmp plug-in from Pro Tools on the bass track, or they would duplicate the bass track and add that distortion plug-in to give it some grit. When you listen to the full mix, you don't hear like a buzzy bass track, but the bass track has some clarity there because a lot of times they're recording bass direct, it's super clean, and adding that grit gives it something extra for your ear to grab onto in the mix. Especially listening on smaller speakers and headphones, you can hear the bass part a little bit better because that distortion or that overdrive created some more harmonic content up in the upper frequencies that allows you to hear the bass. It's a weird phenomenon, and there are plugins that do that specifically just for bass. But I love distortion on drums, bass, and vocals especially. But there are a lot of situations where the raw recording is just boring. It's not doing it for you. It's just not special. And a lot of times if I'm stuck with a particular track or a group of tracks and I'm not sure what to do, I'll at least play around with red light distortion to see if I can create something better than what I have in the session. And a lot of times I end up coming up with something really cool. So let me show you how red light distortion works and how I like to use it. The most important thing to know about red light distortion is that the neon lights light up when there is signal going through. Neon is proven to improve the quality of your signal. I'm kidding, but I think that's really cool. All right, so let's go on a quick tour of the plugin, and let's talk about that. So the main knobs we have are input, which increases the amount of signal going into the distortion or the overdrive circuit. Distortion, which is only available on certain types of distortion. The drive knob, which does exactly what you expect. The output knob, which is your overall volume coming out of the plugin. Mix knob, which lets you blend between your dry signal and the distorted signal. And then a high and low pass filter. Now, the way these work, and I could be wrong, but the way it works to my ear is these are going to change the sound going into the drive. And if you've played around with fuzz pedals, distortion pedals, overdrive pedals on a guitar pedal board, you know the amount of low end hitting a distortion will really change how it sounds. If there's more low end there, it distorts in a very different way than if it doesn't have as much low end. So a humbucker guitar will distort differently than a single coil guitar, or a bass through a guitar pedal is going to sound way different in the way it distorts than just a regular guitar would. This allows us to shape that tone as it's going in. So the tone, maybe we have a really thick, huge bass sound, but maybe we don't, in one situation, want all that low end hitting the distortion because we're going for a different sounding distortion. By just adjusting this low frequency knob, you can really change the overall tone of the distortion quite a bit. And then obviously the highs as well. Maybe it's too harsh, it's ice pick territory. Bring this down to give it a more lo-fi effect, and that will also change the way it distorts. Not quite as much, but it will change it. Now down here is the type. This is pretty cool. So we have several different types of distortion, overdrive, saturation, whatever you want to call it. The ones I use the most, so we've got soft tube, hard tube, bad tube, transistor, fuzz, and op amp. I use soft tube most of the time, and I'll occasionally use fuzz. Or if I'm just not getting the sound I want, I'll flip between them until I find one that I like. If we switch over to something like fuzz, you'll see it looks the same. Which one has? Yeah, hard tube adds the distortion circuit. So distortion and drive are two different things. If you're a guitar player, you probably get that. Drive is like the crunch, the warm tube overdrive, and then distortion is straight up slamming it, making it really crunchy like a metal sounding guitar versus just a slightly crunchy, overdriven, sort of clean guitar. But for me, soft tube and fuzz are my go-tos. Fuzz for bass, soft tube for everything else. And then finally, there are stages over here. This is just kind of like the gear shifter for the plugin. If we want it to overdrive, but when we crank it all the way up, it's still not crazy distorted, we'll stay in stage 1, go in stage 2 and stage 3. It just increases the amount of drive and distortion that's happening. So here's what the plugin sounds like with basically all the settings as far down as they'll go. First, let's hear the dry drum tracks here. And then here it is with the plugin. So by itself, it's fairly clean in its all the way down mode. It's not doing a whole lot to the sound. But as we increase this drive knob, the volume's going to go up. We'll need to bring the volume or the output down. But just listen with full range frequencies what it does to a drum track, which is a pretty full range instrument. Here we go. This is what I love about this. It's not just, it's called red light distortion, but to my ear, I don't use it that way. I use it as a, give me a little warmth, give me a little punch, give me a little grit. Not straight up distorted all the time. Sometimes just something like this can be exactly what the drums need. This song, I've always thought the drums feel really clean. And adding in a little bit of overdrive there gives them a little bit of punch and a little bit of grit. It's different from what EQ does. It's different from what compression does. Probably is a combination of the two, but there's some other things happening because distortion circuits are adding more frequencies. They're adding more harmonics to what's already there versus an EQ, which just boosts and cuts what's already there. And a compressor, you know, does its thing on what's already there. Distortion is adding something new, which sometimes can be really cool. So here it is without the distortion. And here it is with. Snare is a little bit crunchier. Kick drum's a little bit muffled, but in a cool way. And that can be really cool. Now, a couple ways you can do this. You can just do something like this and give a light drive to your tracks. But if you still want the clean, like that crispness of the hi-hat and the cymbals to come through, then you can use this in like a split mode. There's a couple different ways to do it. The way I end up doing it most of the time, you can use the mix knob here, but I've found sometimes the way the distortion interacts with a signal will cause things to feel a little bit phasey. Let me play that for you. It's actually not too bad. But if I go heavy on the overdrive, bring that all the way up, maybe go to phase stage 2 there. Now, if I try to mix that with the dry signal, anywhere in the middle, we lose some of that deep low end in the kick drum. So if something like this, where I want to go, hey, heavy on the distortion and blend the two, which is a really fun thing you should absolutely try on all sorts of tracks. You can do it with the splitter tool, which is kind of beyond what I want to show here. Or for me, a lot of times what I'll do just for simplicity's sake is I'll duplicate the track entirely, okay? We've got 2 drum tracks. I'll take the distortion off the first one and just leave it on the second one. So if we're listening to the second track here, and then we can just, on the faders themselves, we can go in between the two and hear the difference. So here it is with just the dry signal. And then here is the distorted signal. And we can do one really important thing. Well, 2 really important things. We can adjust the balance between them. So I can turn, let's solo both. I can just turn down the distorted one in relation to the clean one. I can also flip the polarity of the distorted one and see if that sounds better. So here it is unflipped. Sounds a little less low end and kind of more mid-rangey. Let's flip and see if that sounds any different. I think I like it the non-flipped way, but that changes every time depending on how much distortion is happening, what all is happening to the signal. Sometimes flipping that polarity it'll do something to either the mid-range or the lows. This time, I felt like the kick drum was kind of the same with both, but the snare drum was beefier with the polarity not flipped, and it was a little too bright with it flipped. I've had situations where the exact opposite has been true, so you'll need to play around with it. But in this instance, I might do something like this. I'll turn the distorted one down, I'll hit play, and I'll just bring it up until I get a nice kind of cool overall combination of both the sound, the cool clean sound and then the distorted sound. So it's not like we're hearing the distortion super loud and obvious, but if I turn this distortion off, listen to how much disappears from the drums. It's kind of cool. And it changes the frequency realm, so you're going to have to kind of set those at a balance that works for you, and then maybe EQ the whole thing combined on another bus to get the sound that you want. But as you can see, endless variations in tone, and we haven't touched an EQ or a compressor. Very, very cool. Now let's take it over to bass. That was the original example that I showed to you. Let me add red light distortion to this bass track and show you some of the cool stuff we can get. So it's not a great example because my brother-in-law loves to add a bunch of drive to his bass when he's recording, which is one of the reasons why I love him. But here it is with no plug-in on. So it's got a little grit to it, but it's not the gritty sounding bass and pedals that he normally uses. So maybe on this one, I want to, let's turn the volume up on the bass a little bit. Maybe this one I want to add some kind of fuzz sound. So I'll go to the fuzz setting. We'll leave all the frequencies in for now and just see what it sounds like. It almost sounds like a synth when you really crank it up. So I had to increase the input a lot because the level of the track is fairly low. Increase the drive, went to stage 3 on it, and then mess with the low frequencies. You probably heard that. It really changed the tone by how much low frequencies I was letting into the circuit. So down there at like, when I was letting in below 40 hertz, it was kind of blowing up the circuit and it didn't sound as pleasant. But rolling off at like 47, then I was getting just enough low end to make it just be nasty and still be kind of clear. All right, then here's the clean signal without it. Now we can just play around with the blend between the two, and we can go maybe nice and clean for a big deep low end, and then a little bit of that distortion added in to let it have a little more clarity. So where it really shines through for me, just as an example, I know this is getting a little long, but I'm just having fun with this. Like the little riff he plays at that chorus where he goes. It's this cool little riff, but without the distortion, we just don't hear it as clearly. Okay, that's it. I had to lower the volume. It was just overall a little too loud. But with the distortion added in, those little riffs come through a little clearer. And so it's the kind of thing, it's subtle. It's one of those things we spend an hour on and it makes a tiny, subtle difference. But it is a cool tool to add. And by the way, red light distortion is included with all versions of Studio One, even the free Prime version. So you can, if you use Studio One in any of its forms, you can start dialing this thing in right away. So for example, on the chorus, let's go over here.
But if life is, and I never was.
Yes, we got a harmony there. Let's add just the regular soft tube. Let's drive that sucker a little bit. See what we get.
And I never was much of a fighter. And I never was much of a fighter. And I never was much of a fighter, and I never was.
So if you ever listen to a mix and you hear that vocal getting loud and you hear a little bit of crunch to it, I used to think it must be something the compressor's doing. And I suppose that could be true sometimes, but I found compressors don't crunch like that usually. It's usually some sort of an overdrive saturation or distortion circuit like this, and it can be really cool in the mix.
And I never was much of a fighter, and I never was much of a fighter, and I never was.
Just gives it some grit if it's not already there in the vocal. These examples aren't the best examples in the whole world, but I just wanted to give you an overview of some different ways that I use it, and those are the main three. I don't usually add it to things like guitars because they already have their own kind of drive to them. But drums, bass, and vocals, if you got something that's a little boring, a little bland, and you want to add some life to it, maybe EQ and compression aren't the only options in your toolbox. Maybe something like a distortion like this that comes with Studio One is the one you should reach for. All right, that's it. If you have questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, do all those things that you're supposed to do, and I'll see you in the next one.